So welcome everyone to the 2018 James McCormick Mitchell Lecture on the First Amendment in the Second Gilded Age. I've been promised by everyone that I'm going to find out exactly what that means. We are pleased to have Professor Jack Balkin from Yale Law School here today with us to discuss how changes in technology and the political economy have shaped debates about free speech. James McCormick Mitchell graduated in 1897 from what was then known as Buffalo Law School. He remained actively engaged in the law school after he graduated. In the early 1900s, along with several other alumni and friends, he helped fund the school's first library. You might not know, but up until then, there was no library, and your only books were in the 8th Judicial Court's District Library. 5 years later, he increased that volume to 5,000. Upon his death in 1948, his wife, Lavinia Mitchell, donated $28,000 in memory of her husband to memorialize his commitment to the advancement of education and to enable the student body to hear a prominent lecture each year. The Mitchell Lecture has been a celebrated tradition at this law school since its inception. It's the law school's only endowed lecture series and has consistently been one of the academic highlights of the year. This year will be no different. The first lecture was held on May 9, 1951, and was given by U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert A. Jackson on wartime security and liberty under the law. The lecture was published that year in the first issue of the Buffalo Law Review. Given that historic precedent, we have had for many years a series of distinguished speakers, of which we are now very pleased to include Professor Balkin from Yale. Thank you very much.
So I'm obviously not Professor Balkin from Yale, but I am the chair of this year's Mitchell Committee, and I just wanted to say a few words before we get to hear from Professor Balkin, mostly to thank this year's Mitchell Committee members, and they are Professor Tico Taussig, Professor Nicole Hallett, Amy Atkinson, and Terry McCormick. This was a particularly difficult year for me, so I wasn't as involved in planning all of the different things that go into the Mitchell Lecture. So fortunately for me and the school, we were all able to pull this off because of the help that we received from many people, both from inside the committee and from outside of the committee. So I just wanted to take a moment to thank especially Terry McCormick. You did a fantastic job, and this would not have happened without you. And the same thing goes for Amy Atkinson, wherever she is. I think she's working on Mitchell stuff right now outside. So thank you to both very much. And I also want to thank colleagues outside of the committee who also helped immensely. Lisa Mueller helped with all the communications related issues. So thank you, Lisa. And also Lainey Orozco helped incredibly. She offered a helping hand when I needed it, and as well, I think this lecture could not have happened without Lainey. There's Amy. Thank you for everything. So regarding the Mitchell, I just wanted to point out as well a sort of like a shift in how we're doing things. In past years, we've done a series of panels with multiple speakers, but this year, one of the things that the committee agreed we wanted to do was bring in just one speaker, one big name, and just concentrate all our efforts on that. And the committee was quick to realize that one big name that had contacts to different people in the committee was Professor Jack Balkin. So we're very happy to have him here. And before we hear from Professor Balkin, I'd like to thank Professor Jonathan Maness, whom I initially mistakenly thought was a member of the Mitchell Committee, and he actually wasn't, so I called him into a meeting. He went, even though he's not a member of the committee. And eventually, Professor Maness was instrumental in everything related to making this Mitchell Lecture happen, including coming up with Professor Jack Balkin's name as a potential speaker, reaching out to him, and now introducing him, since Jonathan worked with Professor Balkin when Jonathan was at Yale Law School. So, Jonathan.
So thank you, Luis. It's true. I will serve even if I'm not supposed to serve. I have the honor today of introducing Professor Jack Balkin. He's the Knight Professor of Constitutional and First Amendment, of Constitutional Law and the First Amendment at Yale Law School. I'm just going to provide a very brief, hopefully amusing, intellectual biography, and give you a sense of the kind of scholar and mentor that Jack is. So unbeknownst to many people, probably everyone in this room, there are actually 5 different Jack Balkins. There's one here today. We're not sure which one is here. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about each one of these Jack Balkins. So the first Jack Balkin is Jack Balkin, the cultural theorist. So since right at the beginning of his career, he has been explaining and developing postmodernist and deconstructivist thought as applied to the legal enterprise. He's engaged in the discourse on critical legal studies. He published a book called Cultural Software that is still, about 20 years ago, which is still one of the most influential theories of ideology and how ideologies shift over time. So that's the first Jack Balkin. The second Jack Balkin is Jack Balkin, the constitutional theorist. That's the one you might know. You're most likely to know, probably. So Jack's clearly one of the most influential constitutional scholars writing today. And several years ago, Jack, who's no conservative, made a splash by declaring that he was now an originalist too. He published a book called Living Originalism that basically tamed originalism, made it safe for progressives, and showed that there wasn't necessarily a conflict between taking original meaning seriously and also having space for progressive constitutional development. Jack is a frequent commentator on the Constitution, and his thinking is really deeply tethered to the practical stakes of constitutional law and how it lives in our culture. So that's the second Jack. The third Jack, I'll go more quickly now. The third Jack is Jack Balkin, the futurist and the scholar of technology. So Jack's written dozens of articles on emerging issues like digital free speech, the surveillance state, most recently the law of artificial intelligence and robotics. He was thinking about the internet before almost anybody else in the legal academy, and he's still on the cutting edge. The fourth Jack Balkin, and I think the one that we're going to hear from today, is Jack Balkin, the First Amendment scholar. It's right there in his title, Professor of the First Amendment and Constitutional Law. And Jack has written about the First Amendment for decades. He's written about its foundations, its shifting ideological valence, and especially its importance in the digital age when so much of our lives are mediated by information flows. So if you've read all of his work, you'd know those, you'd actually would know that those 4 Jack Balkins existed. But the fifth one that you might not know exists is Jack Balkin, the mentor and institution builder. So more than 20 years ago, Jack founded the Information Society Project at Yale. As I understand it, the ISP, as it's known, started basically as a small group of students meeting in a dank basement in an unrenovated building somewhere in an undisclosed location on Yale's campus. And it's now grown into one of the most important centers for the interdisciplinary study of technology and society in the country. Around the ISP, Jack is known as the Godfather. You might wonder why. Well, obviously he founded the place. But he also founded a clinic called the Media Freedom and Information Access Clinic, MFIA, the Mafia Clinic. So he's the godfather of the Mafia. Everyone also knows that once you leave the ISP family, well, you can't ever leave the ISP family. Once you join, you never leave. Apparently, they will come check on you in Buffalo to make sure you're staying in line. But I think the real reason that Jack is the godfather is because he's responsible for making so many people's careers. That's just the truth. So when you look out at the academy today, and you think about people working on technology and society, Jack's fingerprints are everywhere. Law schools around the country, departments of communication, information science, journalism, media studies, science and technology studies, engineering. There's his former students and advisees are everywhere. And I think that's really the most important thing to know about Jack. He's incredibly intellectually generous. If you spend enough time with him, you realize that he's almost always the most brilliant person in the room, but he doesn't use that brilliance to cut people down or to prove he's the smartest guy. He really engages with the other person's project. He figures out what's important, interesting in it. He tells you what's really interesting about your own work and tells you how to make it better. And that's really, I think, I think that's really the reason that his former students and advisees are so loyal to him. So I'll just close with one short story to give you a sense of how influential Jack's been. So as you may have heard, a few days ago, Mark Zuckerberg, the 33-year-old billionaire CEO of Facebook, was testifying before Congress for the first time in his life. And Senator Brian Schatz from Hawaii was questioning him. And right near the end of his time, Senator Schatz said the following, I'll quote, "In the time I've left, I want to propose something to you, Mr. Zuckerberg. I read an interesting article this week by Professor Jack Balkin at Yale that proposes the concept of an information fiduciary." Then he goes on to explain basically the concept in 2 sentences. And he asked Zuckerberg, "Are you open to the idea of an information fiduciary enshrined in statute?" So that's pretty good, right? Zuckerberg's response is even better. Zuckerberg says, "Senator, I think it's certainly an interesting idea, and Jack is very thoughtful in this space, so I do think it deserves consideration." So I thought that was amazing for a lot of reasons. First of all, it's the fact that Mark Zuckerberg has to pretend to have read Jack's work in order to impress a senator is just terrific. You've made it when that happens. Second, I want to point out that Mark, or Zuck, is on a first-name basis with Jack. They're apparently buds. And seriously, though, if Jack's ideas about the internet and privacy are gaining some traction, we're all the better for it, because we might not end up in a dystopian digital future. So today Jack isn't going to be talking about our digital overlords. Instead, I think he's going to be talking about our economic overlords. To be a little bit more precise, Jack will be talking about what the current era of enormous economic inequality means for freedom of speech, and why we might need to rethink the purposes of the First Amendment in this second Gilded Age. I think we're all in for a terrific lecture today. I'm very excited for it. And with a little luck, in a few years' time, you might see a CEO on C-SPAN being questioned about the ideas that you hear today. So thanks very much. And without further ado, Professor Jack Balkin.
Let me get my technology ready for this lecture. There we go. Hey everyone, how are you today? Apparently so. I am going to talk about the First Amendment in the Second Gilded Age. Do you all know what the First Gilded Age was? Anybody know a little bit about the First Gilded Age? Any of you were living in the First Gilded Age? A few of you were. Okay, that's fine. So the First Gilded Age runs basically from around, about middle of the 1870s, 1880s, up until the beginning of the Progressive Era, so around the turn of the 20th century. And I'm going to describe it to you, and I just want you to think to yourself, does any of this sound familiar? Okay, so it's a period of rapid expansion in business. Huge fortunes are made, and enormous inequality of wealth occurs during this period. There are large waves of immigration into the United States, which produces enormous resentment against immigrants. It's the period which has heightened racial tensions. It's also the period when Plessy versus Ferguson is decided. It's a period of increasing populism and populist demagoguery. It's a period of enormous wasteful spending on luxury by people with enormous amounts of money who have more money than brains. And it's a period that becomes deeply politically corrupt. So corrupt, in fact, that people wonder whether or not American democracy will survive. Any of that sound familiar? Yeah. We are now in the Second Gilded Age. This is, roughly speaking, the period that begins, I'd say somewhere with the computer revolution in the 1980s, but really takes off with the digital revolution, with the internet's commercialization in the middle of the 1990s. And it's also produced enormous fortunes. It's also, at the very same time, a period of racial tension, of increasing fights over immigration, a period of populist demagoguery, a period in which government increasingly is for sale, and also a period in which people are increasingly worried whether American democracy will survive. But there's an important difference between the first Gilded Age and the second Gilded Age. In the first Gilded Age, a really important liberty value, that was the value of free labor, which was the liberty value that was argued for on behalf of the liberation of African Americans out of slavery, the idea that people own the right to their own labor and therefore slavery was immoral and unjust and should be made unconstitutional. That idea was taken up in the second half of the 19th century and turned into the defense not of African Americans, but of corporations. This is the period that ultimately leads to the shift in the political meaning of freedom of contract into what we now think of as Lochner. The ideological drift of the free labor principle. The second Gilded Age is different. In the second Gilded Age, a treasured liberty, one which is seen as central to American democracy itself, its political valence eventually shifts so that it also becomes a defense of the forms of capitalism of the late 20th century. In this case, the liberty is the liberty of speech. And there's a huge literature now on the Lochnerization of the First Amendment. People often focus either on campaign finance law and the Supreme Court and the DC Circuit's decisions on campaign finance, which have, I think, led to the destruction of the Republican Party and the increasing corruption of American politics. And also people have focused on the expansion of commercial speech doctrine, which has now been used to challenge many features of the administrative state, or in the words of Steve Bannon, the deconstruction of the administrative state, in areas ranging from consumer protection to drug regulation. And pretty soon, I assume there will be the attack on the securities laws, and probably many other features of business regulation, all through the First Amendment. And these are very interesting topics, and they're related to the ideological drift of the First Amendment. But I'm actually interested in a third topic, one that is ripped from today's headlines, literally ripped from today's headlines, and it concerns the relationship between freedom of speech and privacy. But it also concerns a serious and recurring problem of freedom of expression in capitalist societies. This is the problem of how to pay for the public sphere. And that's the issue that I'm going to discuss through most of my lecture. How, in a society, a capital society, do we pay for the freedom of speech? Freedom of speech really isn't free. It actually depends on an infrastructure of free expression. It depends on technologies, institutions, social practices. These aren't free, they cost money. And how do we pay for it? Because, of course, without a vibrant public sphere, we really can't have democracy. So that's the central issue. It was an issue in the 20th century. It is an issue today, only the conditions are different in the 20th century than they were today, and I'm going to spend some time talking about the difference in these conditions. So why don't I then begin with this, but I just want to point out where I'm going. I'm going to try to explain to you how we pay for speech in the Second Gilded Age. And then I'm going to show how the way that we pay for speech in the Second Gilded Age produced the most recent scandal that was in the news. That's the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal. This scandal is, in fact, a characteristic scandal of the Second Gilded Age, precisely because it is connected to the way in which we pay for freedom of speech. That's really what this lecture is about, and that's why it's about the First Amendment of the Second Gilded Age. One last thing I want to mention. Although this lecture is called the First Amendment of the Second Gilded Age, it should more properly probably be called freedom of expression in the Second Gilded Age, but I couldn't resist the first and second, alternation. Here's why. One of the most interesting features of the public sphere in the Second Gilded Age is that the First Amendment, or rather, more correctly, the judicial doctrines that have been created to protect freedom of expression and a free press, are increasingly irrelevant to the actual protection of freedom of expression online. That may sound crazy, and to a certain extent, it's certainly true that the First Amendment serves as a necessary backup for the protection of free expression. But when we focus on free expression online, there are statutes that turn out to be far more important than the First Amendment itself. And moreover, most of the free expression that people engage in online, if you, for example, subscribe to any social media site, or you use a Gmail, or you use Google as a search engine, or any number of applications, that whole infrastructure is privately owned. And because it's privately owned, the First Amendment does not, strictly speaking, apply to it. And so that means that we've moved into an era in which the basic determinants of free expression are more and more detached from the judicial doctrines of the First Amendment. In fact, and this is the great irony of the Second Gilded Age, in the Second Gilded Age, the First Amendment, when it appears at all, often appears as an obstacle or a hindrance to legislation or to administrative regulation that would police these private infrastructure owners and require them to protect freedom of speech and privacy. This is one of the enormous ironies of the way in which constitutional doctrine has interacted with the dominant economy of our era, that is, the digital economy. But more about that later. First, let me take you in the Wayback Machine and talk about the 20th century. Many of you were alive in the 20th century. Most of you, I think, here were alive in the 20th century, but you probably don't remember it. So let me take you in the Wayback Machine. The big difference between 20th century media and 21st century media can be summed up in this idea. 20th century media were mostly broadcast media and mass media. I'll put aside obvious exceptions like telephones, which are one-to-one, and ham radio, which is, broadcasting for the masses. Most people were not ham radio operators, and most people didn't, and the central way in which we engaged in public discourse was not through the telephone. Rather, the central institutions were the press, newspapers, radio stations, television stations, book publishing houses, and movie production studios. These were all mass communication, and they were mostly few to many. That is to say, a relatively small number of people operated these media, and they broadcast or published or distributed the media product to a very large number of people. That's really important to understand because it affected the way in which people thought about free expression and the issues of free speech theory. For example, the most famous free speech theorist in the 20th century is probably Alexander Meiklejohn. Alexander Meiklejohn's view was that the purpose of freedom of expression was to inform the public so that they could engage in self-governance. So an informed public was central to the purposes of free expression, and that makes perfect sense if you live in a world in which most people don't own the means of communication and don't have access to it. Rather, they are listeners. And so Meiklejohn's theory is a listener-centered theory. The most important thing, he says, is not that everyone shall get to speak, because after all, not everybody is going to get to speak, but that everything worth saying shall be said. This makes perfect sense in a 20th century world of mass communications and broadcast media. Most people don't own CBS. Most people will never appear on CBS. Most people will never get a column in the New York Times. But everyone will read the New York Times, everybody will watch CBS, and therefore, in this asymmetry of who talks and who listens, it's very important to make sure you have an informed public. That's the 20th century and how the 20th century thought about media. Now think about the 21st century, which really, honestly, begins in the final years of the 20th century, say the commercialization of the internet in 1995, and really takes off at the very end in the dot-com boom and bust. If you think about 21st century media are quite different. 21st century media, instead of being one to many or few to many, are now many to many, in the sense that you can now communicate potentially, in theory, with anyone, anywhere in the world. And not only can you communicate to a single person, you can communicate to an indefinite number of persons. And so people pointed out at the beginning of this internet age that everyone was now a broadcaster. And they also understood that speech was inexpensive, that everyone had access to means of communication, that everybody could be their own television star, their own radio star, their own author speaking to everyone. This was, in fact, the great transformation. But not only in terms of access, but also in terms of the business models that characterized media companies in the 21st century. 20th century media companies were primarily the broadcasters and publishers of the content of a relatively few people. So Random House didn't publish everybody's book, they published a relatively small number of people's books. CBS only had a limited amount of programming available in its channels, so only a small number of people actually produced it, and the same thing with newspapers. And that meant that much of what these 20th century media companies did was produce their own content or contract with a relatively small number of artists, writers, producers, and musicians to produce the content. That is to say, they were not fora for general participation by the public. They were, in fact, producing their own content or the content of a small number of contractual partners. Now, if you look at 21st century media, it's a completely different story. 21st century media, and here I'll give you an example of Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, right? To just give you, these media are all about having other people produce stuff. And how? Facebook would die on the vine if everybody wasn't constantly checking in and posting. Google lives off your creating web pages with links, so it can send its spiders out to harvest the links and get the information and download the pages so it can create its search engine. Instagram wants you to take photos. Please take more photos and more photos. Twitter wants you not only to follow what's going on, it wants you to tweet. Would you please tweet some more? How about retweeting? How about liking something? Would you please do that for us? So we've had a transformation in the very idea of what it means to be a media company. 20th century media, listen to what we're going to produce for you. Watch the shows we're going to create for you. 21st century media, please post, please link, please like, please tweet. That's the big difference. Now, the next thing you have to understand about the political economy of freedom of speech in the 20th versus the 21st centuries is how you pay for it. In the 20th century, if you think about it, there are a relatively small number of ways to make money in order to produce a public sphere. You can sell media goods, right? That would be selling a book. You can offer subscriptions. That would be cable subscriptions or Book of the Month Club subscriptions, right? And the other possibility would be advertising. And the kind of model for making money you chose depended on the nature and limitations of the medium. If you were a newspaper, you could sell subscriptions, circulation. You could also sell individual newspapers on a newsstand. And this was a really important part of the 20th century newspaper. You could also get advertising, especially classified advertising, and therefore what you would do is you would make money all three ways. Book publishers generally just sold media goods. They usually didn't include advertisements in the books, although there are some examples of this, right? They didn't use subscription too much, but there were Book of the Month Club, History Book Club, that sort of thing. But if you were a broadcaster, that is to say, you were radio or television, you had to rely pretty much on advertising. That's because until very recently, almost all broadcasting was free. With cable, you get the possibility of subscription. And so with cable, you get subscription and advertising. But for radio and television, it's advertising. Now think about 21st century media and think about the possible business models. You can have subscription, that's Pandora, right? That's Spotify. You can have the purchase of individual goods. That was the way in which music was sold for the first 10 or 15 years, iTunes. But eventually, Apple too has moved toward a subscription service, Apple Music, right? But if you're Facebook or if you're Google, right, or if you're Twitter, you're probably not going to rely on subscription or the sale of individual media goods. Instead, you're going to rely on advertising. And indeed, that's the business model of most of these major infrastructure providers. Now, here we should distinguish between basic internet services and the applications on top. Basic internet service is broadband service. That's subscription. You pay monthly bill for your cable or your DSL. But if you think about the applications placed on top, that is to say a Gmail or Google or Facebook or Twitter, it's all done through advertising. And that is a self-reinforcing mechanism, because since the basic business model of these folks is to increase the number of end users, right? That's how they survive. They need as many people as possible. And so if they shifted to a subscription model, they would have many fewer users. And so as a result, they offer their services for free to attract as many people as possible and try to keep them on the site as long as possible and using it as much as possible so that they can be exposed to as much advertising as possible. And that explains a great deal of why the 21st century media ecology looks the way it looks. So if you think about that then, you can see where I'm going to be going. What is the result of an infrastructure of free expression that is primarily based on the exchange of free services for advertising? And the answer can be summed up in one word: surveillance. Let me expand. In the 20th century, there were only very primitive methods of targeted advertising. So, for example, some magazines, like Sports Illustrated or Elle, right, they basically had targeted audiences. So advertisers would obviously buy ads in magazines that had targeted audiences. Sports Illustrated for enthusiasts, Elle for people interested in fashion, and so on and so on. Car and Drive for people interested in automobiles. When you got to radio, there could be some degree of targeted advertising because there would be specializations of different kinds of music, and those things might be tied to different audiences. But for the most part, your ability to target advertisements to individual users was very, very limited. Television might be focused on an 18 to 49 demographic, right? For example, because those people would buy products, and so the advertisements would affect them. But it would be a pretty broad demographic. It wouldn't be targeted. And if you think about the 20th century newspaper took lots of ads, but since the 20th century newspaper wanted as broad as possible an audience, it basically couldn't target even if it wanted to. And so the result is the forms of advertising you see in the 20th century tend to be blunderbuss, broad-based. They try to be targeted, but there's very limited ways in which you can target. They do the best they can, given the forms, the business models and the forms of communication, but there are limits to what you could do. Now let's turn to the 21st century. In the 21st century, Facebook and Twitter and Google, they now have the ability to target advertisements to individual end users. Why? And the reason has to do with another key feature of 21st century media. Now, the idea is simply this. In 21st century media, or rather with 21st century technology, everything you do leaves a trace. If you're at the keyboard right now, in theory, your keystrokes can be recorded. If you're clicking on a site, in theory, that can be recorded. The amount of time you spend on the site can be recorded. Where you go from site to site can be recorded. Who you contact can be recorded. Your likes and dislikes can be recorded. That is to say, the creation of this medium was a medium that was simultaneously a method of broadcasting and a method of surveillance. This was not true of 20th century media. Unless you were a Nielsen family, that is, you agreed to have a set-top box put in your house, it was very difficult for broadcasters to know what you were watching and how long you watched it, right? If you went and bought a paperback book at a bookstore, it was impossible for Signet Classics to know whether you read the book at all and how far you read in it. They just had no way to do it. But if you have a Kindle, Amazon can tell when you open the Kindle book up first, how many pages you read, how long it took you to get to the end of the book, and whether you even got to the end of the book. They can also tell whether there were certain parts of the book you liked the best. They even encourage you to underline and send things to other people, giving additional information about what you like to read and what's interesting to you and what's not interesting to you. That is to say, every single new media characteristic of the 21st century is both a method of communication and a method of surveillance. All of the technologies we use to broadcast, that we use to communicate with each other, are also simultaneously methods of mass communication or broadcasting and also methods of surveillance. And so we come to this really interesting result. In the 21st century, the infrastructure of mass communication, the infrastructure of everyday communication, is also the infrastructure of surveillance. But I'm not done yet. We are now moving into the world of the Internet of Things and personal robots. I'm sure many of you have iPhones and you know about Siri. Siri is a personal assistant, right? And Siri wants to know what you think very, very much. And if you want, you can actually turn it on so that Siri is always listening to you. So that if you ever say, "Hey Siri," Siri will immediately respond. And Apple would actually like you to do that, would like you to have that setting, so Siri can always be there to answer any questions you might have, right? Similarly, Alexa. Alexa is at home. You've seen the wonderful commercials where the father asks, how big is a whale? How much is a whale? And Alexa's right there with an answer. And do you know why? Because Alexa is listening to you. It's listening to everything that's going on in the house. But it knows to stay silent until it's been called for, right? This is very much like, hey, by the way, how many of you people ever watched Downton Abbey? Any of you watch Downton Abbey? All right, that's good. It's about nobility in the first part of the 20th century and their relationships with the servant class, right? So you have Carson the butler and all these folks. Well, in a sense, Alexa wants to be like Carson the butler, right? Or Mrs. Hughes. They're there, they're silent, they don't say anything unless they're spoken to, but they're always listening, right? There's a saying, by the way, no man is a hero to his own valet. And I would just tell you that no one is a hero to their own Alexa. As we move forward, you see this technology of surveillance is not simply tied to every form of personal communication. It will be increasingly tied to almost all appliances we use, from cars to ovens to refrigerators. They'll all be designed to collect data. Any of you have a Fitbit? Any of you use Fitbit? Well, that's collecting data on your pulse and and other things about you. And that's basically the world you're moving into. And all of this is heavily subsidized by the collection of data. And that's the 20th century, the 21st century. That's how we pay for the public sphere. We pay for the public sphere through a grand bargain. We, that is the owners of infrastructure, will give you a search engine that is miraculous, because in fact you can't really have communication on the internet without a search engine. It just wouldn't work. It finds anything within seconds. Exactly what you want, too. You rarely have to go past 2 or 3 pages in Google to find what you want. We will give you amazing social media that will allow you to communicate to anyone, anywhere. We will give you new ways of being amusing, interesting, and entertaining. We will give you all these wonderful things, and in return, you will give us information about you. You will let us surveil you. That is the grand bargain of the political economy of 21st century media. That's how we pay for the public sphere. That's how we pay for freedom of expression. This leads to 3 problems, which I'll go through very quickly because I want to get on to the last one. The first problem is the problem of private governance. As we move into this world and more people are on social media to communicate, you know what happens when you get a large number of people together. Some of them misbehave. In fact, a lot of them misbehave. And so what happens is Facebook and Twitter and other social media spend more and more of their time not simply facilitating or opening their space for communication. They spend their time governing. That's right, they govern spaces. They have a terms of service, they have an end user license agreement, they have community guidelines, and they enforce those guidelines. They are increasingly like sovereigns in the sense that they have rules for the community and they enforce the rules for the community. This is private governance, except that they don't have every possible sanction that a real sovereign would have. Right, a territorial sovereign has all sorts of fines and punishments, but in fact they have very limited ways in which they can sanction. They can kick you off for a while or forever, or they can block or slow down or remove what you say. So largely, if we say they're like a sovereign, they're a sovereign with a very limited set of sanctions that are mostly about access, right? But private governance actually turns out to be a central feature of this new system. And that's why the First Amendment is increasingly irrelevant, because the governance is governance of a private actor as opposed to the governance of the state, to which the First Amendment applies. The second problem is what I've called the new school of speech regulation. New school speech regulation. Old school, kicking it old school, is what nation states do to individual speakers or publishers or movie producers. That is to say, it's the state regulating the speaker, the state regulating the publisher, the state regulating the newspaper, the state regulating the movie producer. It is criminal punishments, fines, injunctions, basically directed at the speaker. That's old school. And it's, or you can basically send thugs out to beat the crap out of people. That's always in good taste, always done, still done all over the world. Old school speech regulation, we still have it, practiced all over the world, always in good taste, but the new form of speech regulation is new school speech regulation. New school speech regulation is where you go after the infrastructure provider to get them to govern and control the speaker. As I said, once you get private governance, and as you get more and more precise and predictable forms of private governance because of surveillance, then it becomes more and more tempting to use the social media or the infrastructure provider to do your censoring for you, to do your blocking for you. And so new school speech regulation is putting pressure on the social media or infrastructure provider to govern speech. Why would you do that? Very simple. There are too many speakers. Everyone's a speaker now. In the old days, there were a relatively small number of people you could throw in jail. There are a relatively small number of troublemakers you could kick the crap out of them. But now, in the internet age, everyone is a potential troublemaker. Everyone is a potential dissident. And they may not be in the country. they may not even be people. They may be robots. They may be bots. And so it becomes more and more important to put pressure on the infrastructure provider to achieve whatever regulatory goals the state has. And so the European Union has placed pressure on the major social media in order to go combat hate speech. Congress just passed a law which was designed to go after sex trafficking sites, right? And this has very predictable effects. It will cause infrastructure providers to overblock and overcensor so as to avoid dangers of regulation. And so that's new school speech regulation. That's the second problem that's created. And the third, which I'm going to spend the rest of this lecture about, is the problem of private surveillance. Private surveillance I've already touched on. Private surveillance is the effect of the grand bargain that pays for the public sphere, the digital public sphere. And it also is an amazing source of wealth. Now, before I go on with this, I just want to point out the following. We don't have to have a system of private surveillance. It's possible, for example, to imagine that the entire public sphere, digital public sphere, could be engaged in through public provisioning. Just as, for example, in Great Britain for many years, they didn't have privately owned television stations, but they had the BBC. Canada had the CBC. You could imagine a system in which the government controlled the search engine. The government created its own social media site. You could imagine it. And indeed, if you look at China, you'll see that there's very close connections between the dominant search engine, Baidu, and the Chinese government, and very close connections between the dominant social media programs in China and the Chinese government. Even if they're officially or semi-officially private, in fact, they're very much tied to the state, and that's because China really, really wants to know what people are doing, and it wants to control what people are doing. This has not been the general solution in Western countries. That is to say, you haven't seen the development of a public search engine. It's possible that we could have a public option for social media. You could have a public option for Facebook, Facebook.us. But if you had Facebook.us, there would immediately be a series of issues. One is whether or not, under the First Amendment, the government could, in fact, enforce civility norms in the same way that Facebook does. It might have problems under the First Amendment, ironically. And second of all, now the surveillance wouldn't be private surveillance, it would be public surveillance. That is, the government would have access to all that data about you and what you're doing, and you'd have to make sure that a government public option, Facebook, was held to incredibly strict limits on the data it could collect and what it could do with that data. That is to say, you'd have to devise a system, you'd have to have the political will to devise such a system to prevent the kind of public surveillance that would fall out from it. And it's an interesting question as to whether or not Congress would in fact do that, or whether it would be deeply tempted by the existence of all that data. So as a result, what we have is a very different system. We have primarily private surveillance, which nation states try to piggyback off of and to make use of for their own purposes. Which brings me to my next point. How many of you have heard of the slogan, "Big data is the new oil"? Has anybody heard that slogan? It's now a trite slogan in Silicon Valley. It refers to the fact that when you move to this particular form of political economy, this particular way of purchasing or paying for the public sphere, you generate enormous amounts of data, and that data can be monetized. It's estimated, and I don't have the exact figures, but that the amount of data that's been generated in the last 5 years or so may be the majority of data that has ever been generated. And that's because of the rise of social media. It'll only get bigger as more people participate and link and like and dislike and send links and basically retweet and do all the things you do on social media. All of this adds to the stock of data. When people say big data is the new oil, what they mean is there's this resource lying around like pools of oil underneath the Earth's surface. And if you were John D. Rockefeller and you had the ambition and the gumption, you could find a way to get that oil from under the surface, and you could use it to finance industrial capitalism and make a fortune. Well, in the same way, people think, there's all this data lying around. We can collect it, we can analyze it, we can collate it, and if somebody has enough gumption to do that, they can finance digital capitalism, or as it's now called, surveillance capitalism, and make a fortune. And in fact, that's what happened. Only instead of titans of industry named Vanderbilt, we have a company named Alphabet. Right? Instead of somebody named Rockefeller, we have somebody named Zuckerberg with enormous fortunes. This is the second Gilded Age. And so I have a different saying I like to say about big data. I like to say that big data is Soylent Green. Anybody ever watch Soylent Green? Yes, and at the very end of the movie, I don't mean to spoil it for you, but at the end of the movie, Charlton Heston says, "It's people! Soylent Green is people." Well, that's right. Big data is people. And that's the way it works. You see, in a sense, this political economy of surveillance capitalism, this political economy of the public sphere, how we pay for it, basically turns you into monetization. It turns you into something that people will buy and sell, advertisers will buy and sell. And of course, that leads me to the next point, very important when you think about political economy. You're all of you, working for the man. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think about how these forms of economy work, they depend on contributions by those who speak to each other, those who post, those who like, those who retweet, and so forth. Those who create links that can be harvested and used to create the search engine. So every time you post, you're working for the man. Every time you retweet, you're working for the man. Every time you like or dislike, you're working for the man. Every time you take a picture of a cake and post it on Instagram, every time you take a cute cat video and post it on YouTube, you, my friends, are working for the man. And of course, what's interesting about that is, in this way, we harness entertainment, boredom, amusement, and turn it into monetization. We turn it into something that you can make money from. This actually is an interesting example of something that my friend Yochai Benkler imagined at the beginning of the internet age. He was influenced by Linux, a open source software operating system, and Wikipedia, still one of the most successful open source projects. He noted that people working without pay, without remuneration, could generate incredibly valuable information products. Linux is an example, and Wikipedia is an even better example. And so he had a dream. He imagined a world in which we could make more and more things through pure production methods. We wouldn't need large corporations with huge bureaucracies. Instead, we could harness the internet to make lots of valuable media products, information products, and it would be more democratic, more participatory, and less hierarchical. That was his dream circa 2006. What happened was that many capitalists in Silicon Valley had the same dream, only they saw it differently. Instead of creating all these free media products for the general good of mankind, like Wikipedia, they said, we're going to harness everybody's cat videos and pictures of cakes and gossip and all that into making ourselves money. And that way we can have, instead of strongly hierarchical systems, we can have a relatively small number of employees and we can extend our operations worldwide. And that's exactly what you see. The flip side of working for the man is to be an object of surveillance and to be monetized. Now, the problem for Facebook, and here I'm going to spend most of my time talking about Facebook, is that Facebook faces a kind of upper limit. How do you make money and grow over time? You make money and grow over time in one of two ways. One way you grow and make money over time is by getting more people to join the site. Well, Facebook's now at 2 billion people. At some point, they're going to run out of people unless they expand their operations to Alpha Centauri. The other possibility is that Facebook can simply get you to spend more time on Facebook. And that's why Facebook is designed the way it is. It's designed to be a time suck. It's designed to be fascinating, interesting, so that you spend more time on the site. Same thing with Twitter and all these others. It's actually designed to get your attention because in the 20th century, access to media was a scarce commodity. In the 21st century, attention is a scarce commodity. And whoever gains the most attention, either in numbers of persons or amount of time they spend, makes the most money. There's a third possible way that Facebook could make money. It could make money by allowing other people to use its data in order to engage in their own projects of surveillance and analysis, and then take a cut of the money. And this brings us to the scandal. Facebook had a program, several programs, by which it allowed third parties to gain access to data of its end users. Most of those were for profit, where Facebook would take a cut of the money received, monetized. Some of them were non-for-profits. This was because Facebook had, and still has, a very strong interest in being friends with data scientists and social scientists around the world who use data. And so it's very important to understand that if you're Facebook, you don't want data scientists disliking you. You want data scientists to depend on you, and therefore you want to be getting good with them. So it had methods by which it would allow access to data for data scientists and social scientists, who would then in turn perform experiments on people. Right? Isn't that delightful? Now, if you did this in a university, you would be subject to a university review board for human subjects. But since Facebook is not a university, it could probably purchase every university, but it's not a university. It wasn't bound by these ethical constraints. And so it was a wonderful way to get an end run around whatever it is you happen to do. And this is what leads to the Cambridge Analytica scandal. A fellow by the name of Alexander Kogan said to Facebook, "I am a data scientist. I would like to perform an experiment." Facebook said, "Be my guest. Here is our platform guidelines." And so what happened was that Kogan ran a personality quiz on Mechanical Turk. This is getting complicated, but let me explain. Mechanical Turk is an application on Amazon that allows people for very small amounts of money to do tasks for whoever wants to hire them. And so what he did is he offered people $1 if they would take a personality quiz. To get to the personality quiz, they would sign in using Facebook. That would immediately unleash access to their Facebook social graph. And it turns out not only their social graph, but the social graph of their friends, their Facebook friends. So with some approximately 250,000 people taking the test on Mechanical Turk and signing in using Facebook password and username, they were able to get, at last count, the number has gone up, 87 million social graphs. Because everybody had friends. And some of you, by the way, have lots of friends. And you are especially valuable. You know who you are. It turned out, though, that Kogan was not some ordinary data scientist. He was actually in cahoots with a for-profit venture called Cambridge Analytica, which uses data about people to try to create psychological profiles that help it better assess their likely political leanings and also how easily they can be manipulated by targeted political messages. That's the scandal that ultimately caused Mark Zuckerberg to have to travel to Washington, D.C. for 2 days of grilling by Congress. But you should understand there are many different parts of this scandal, and we should separate them out. One is the fact that Cambridge Analytica uses people who are not American citizens. And therefore, what they were doing is they were engaging in targeted political advertising, and that might fall afoul of the campaign finance rules. And I assume that Special Prosecutor Mueller might be interested in that part of the scandal. Another thing that people are upset about is that there were targeted political advertisements. Now here I want to explain to you that targeted political advertisements are protected by the First Amendment. Saying one thing to one constituency and another thing to another constituency is as American as apple pie, or more correctly, it is as American as apple pie to you and cherry pie to you. So people were creeped out by the targeted political advertisements, but here the First Amendment really does come back into the story. The First Amendment would be a restriction on preventing targeted political advertising, at least unless you had a very significant showing that would allow you to overcome strict scrutiny, essentially. I think the really most interesting part of the scandal, and the thing that I want to focus on, is not the fact that it was targeted political ads, and not even the fact that the ads might have been produced by people who are not US citizens in an election, which might have violated the campaign finance rules. It's rather that this was the tip of the iceberg, that essentially the entire digital economy, that is, the economy that made the fortunes of the Second Gilded Age, depended so heavily on the monetization of personal data and its use for purposes of manipulation and surveillance in unexpected ways. This seems to me to be the most scandalous part of the scandal. And this is where I'm going to now offer my normative assessment of what to do. Here's the question, put in its starkest form. Do you want to preserve a digital public sphere in the 21st century? Do you want to preserve the gains that allow everyone to communicate potentially with everyone else? Do you want to preserve the possibility of everyone being a broadcaster? Do you want to preserve the amazing search engine that you have for free, the amazing methods of communicating and sharing information and ideas, and gossiping, and watching cat videos, and uploading photos of your vacation to make your friends jealous? Do you want to preserve all of those things? If you want to preserve all of those things, you need to find a way to pay for it. Now, so far, the best way to do it is through an advertising model. It's true we could go to a subscription model, but when we went to a subscription model, I just want to point out many, many people would not participate anymore. And so the entire value of the system would be less than it is now. But if we're going to preserve some form of advertising model, and a model that involves some form of data collection and analysis in targeted advertising, that is if, because you can give it up tomorrow. You can say, I don't want that. And then you'll just have a much less rich, much less powerful, much less potent public sphere. But you could do that. If you want to do it, then you have to do something else. You have to find a way to prevent these companies, which are the great success stories of the Second Gilded Era, these social media companies and search engine companies, from misusing and abusing their position as the collectors of personal data. Now, I have a proposal about that. That proposal is that we should treat these companies as information fiduciaries. What is an information fiduciary? It is a fiduciary, that is somebody who is obligated to look out for your interests and who owes you a duty of care and loyalty, who primarily deals in personal information about you. That's what makes them an information fiduciary. It turns out this idea is not new at all. It is the idea, to a certain extent, that we apply in the professions. Doctors and lawyers and accountants and estate managers are personal fiduciaries. They are fiduciaries toward their clients and their beneficiaries. They cannot use the information which they gain in the course of providing services to manipulate or undermine their clients. They have to take care to keep the information secure. They have to make sure that if they give it to anyone else, that person is also bound by the same obligations of confidentiality and loyalty. And they can't use the information to act like a con artist, to basically gather people into them, tell them that they can be trusted, and then betray that trust. This is the basic idea of the information fiduciary. And I think that the second Gilded Age has produced a new group of information fiduciaries that will succeed the old ones that we associate with the professions. These are the social media companies and the operators of the digital public infrastructure, as well as the new businesses and applications that are turning every appliance and every object you own into a source of monetization of data. They are all, in my view, information fiduciaries. Alexa is an information fiduciary. Your personal robot is an information fiduciary. Indeed, your self-driving car should be an information fiduciary as well. Currently, the law does not recognize this concept in precisely these terms, but all of the elements of the idea are already present in law. It's just a matter of a common law court or an administrative agency or a state legislature or Congress basically declaring that these particular businesses are information fiduciaries and have the duties of information fiduciaries. If that happens, then in fact they will still be able to make some money. They'll still be able to make a profit, perhaps not obscene profits, but very healthy profits. It will restrict some of the ways in which they monetize your data, but not others. And they will have special duties to make sure that they don't act like con artists. That is, to induce your trust and reliance in them, to make you vulnerable to them, and then to turn around and betray that trust. The idea of an information fiduciary is only, I should emphasize, one idea for dealing with the problems of the second Gilded Age. A second one is antitrust. Antitrust pretty much fell by the wayside starting in the 80s. But antitrust seems to me to be one of the most important things we need to think about as we ask how to have a democratically responsible system of political economy in the second Gilded Age. Because antitrust has multiple purposes. One purpose of antitrust is simply to ensure consumer welfare. But when the product is being given away for free, it's not clear how we can lower the cost of the product anymore. That suggests that the purpose of antitrust law should be on a different plane. And this takes us back to the origins of antitrust law in the first Gilded Age. Its basic goal is to preserve a democratic political economy by preventing very large organizations to leverage their monopoly power or their oligopoly power to corrupt and undermine the democratic system of government we have in the United States. In other words, to preserve a democratic public sphere. There are really serious problems that come when you can leverage enormous economic power. And they're not just simply about how much the goods cost. They go to questions of how the rest of the economy operates, and they also go to questions of how the political process operates. So, although in this talk I primarily emphasize the idea of information fiduciaries, I don't think that reforms need stop there. I think, in fact, we have to take a long look at the political economy that's made it possible for us to speak to so many people at such low cost and ask how we can make that political economy more consistent with our democratic system of government. That's the challenge for people in the 21st century. And here's the good news. If you had asked someone in 1895 or so about the fate of American democracy, things would have looked pretty grim. Government was essentially for sale. Huge inequalities of wealth were driving people into terrible working conditions, and people were engaged in a form of muscular capitalism that was not just and was not democratic. You might well despair of the future of American democracy, but you know what happened after that. There was a renaissance of reform and improvement of America's democracy. Not perfect in all respects, but certainly better than things stood at the end of the 19th century. The message I want to leave you with is what we did once before at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, we can do again at the beginning of the 21st century. It will require mobilization. It will require politics. It will require complaint. It will require saying that you don't like the way things are. But it has been done before, and we can do it again. Thank you very much.
So we have some questions here. I'm going to start off here with.
Now, I just want to know, are you going to be surveilling these people as you give them methods of communication? You're not going to monetize it, I take it.
No monetizing.
Please, by the way, first of all, please tell me your name and tell me your favorite electronic gadget
Okay.
or technology.
Okay, my name's Mark Bartholomew. I'm a professor here. My son just got an Xbox that I'm playing a lot by myself, so that's probably my favorite electronic gadget.
There you go. Okay.
So I just wanted to get your reaction to this. So I saw this week in the New Republic, there was an essay saying, I know what the solution is to this. Let's just ban all targeted commercial advertising. And it seems if we don't like this political economy, this structure you've talked about, well, we can blow it up by making this new oil, this data, somewhat worthless. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that, political realities aside. What do you think about a solution like that? And maybe along the way, you know, what I wrestle with is just how valuable is the public sphere as it stands now? You know, what are we going to lose if, say, Google has a smaller footprint, Facebook has a smaller footprint? You know, how do we assess those trade-offs?
That's an excellent question. So if you couldn't target advertising at all, you would have a lot less free services. And that would mean that a lot less people would use them. And it would mean that a particular richness of the public sphere would be gone. And that's a trade-off. And many people might think that that's a good thing. One of its consequences would mean that the richer you were, that is, the more disposable income you had, the more able you would be to participate in this public sphere. And the less income you had, the more you would not participate in the public sphere. That's also a trade-off. It's something that you'd want to think about. What's the optimal system? After all, remember, the public sphere we have is a combination even now of subscription plus media product purchase plus free services. So for those of you who have Spotify or Pandora or Apple Music, many of you pay subscriptions, and so you already know what it's like to have access to something based on subscription. So it's possible you could do it. The other thing is the government could provide it for free. That is, the government could create its own search engine. It could create its public option to Facebook. That would create other problems too, as I mentioned before. But yes, it's possible to do it. There are huge startup costs at this point in order to provide a service of the same caliber as the ones we already have. But the question is whether or not you want to spend the money to do it. Again, if you do that, you have to make really, really sure the government isn't harvesting the information for its own purposes. Because under third-party doctrine and other First Amendment doctrines, the government might be able to say, hey, you gave this stuff to us, so it's ours. We can use it. So you'd have to design it so that the government couldn't do bad things with the data. But yes, it's possible. It's a question of what kind of public sphere you want. Now, other people, you didn't say this, but it seems to me implicit in your remarks. Other people have suggested, you know, we don't have a really good public sphere anymore. We have a public sphere that's full of Russian propaganda, bots, porn, misogyny, racism, and bullying. That's basically the public sphere of the early 21st century. And what's to like about that? And so you might say, let's just blow the whole thing up, and we won't have as many bots. And the neo-Nazis will have to find another way to annoy us. And the misogynists will have to find other ways to torment people, and so forth. And although I really do think this is an overreaction, it really is throwing out the bot with the bathwater. That's the way I would put it. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Friend. I guess I use my smartphone the most. I'm a professor. I was just wondering about your thoughts on the surveillance literature. I used to work with Gary Marks a little bit at the University of Colorado, and there's a huge surveillance literature. One of the things that
I was watching you read it.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. Anyway, he really talks a lot about the need to understand the actual practices being used on the ground by those companies. He talks a lot about the cultural context and how different it is in different places. And Gary also talks a lot about sunlight and transparency. He just says that it doesn't matter whether it's police surveillance, it's whatever it is. You have to have the equivalent of a police cam, or something else like that, constantly shedding sunlight. And the reason I'm asking about that is because I'm not sure that having a person be an information fiduciary is going to get us that kind of sunlight. So I wanted to ask you about that particular issue.
Well, this is a very good point. Because if say that you have a duty of loyalty or a duty of care, if nobody watches you, that is, say, no one audits you or makes sure that you're living up to the duty of care, right, then you'll violate it, right? If nobody in other words, you might ask this question: what causes lawyers who are already professionals to abide by their fiduciary duties, or doctors? Well, the answer is a really complicated story. Part of it has to do with the observing them by other professionals, right? Part of it has to do with installation of professional norms. But in the case of these companies, what we don't yet have is a set of professional norms of the kind that we associate with traditional fiduciaries. And as a result, we can't assume that they'll be very, very well behaved. You might need to have some way of auditing them or watching what they do. And so I think that's right. I think that a system like this would probably need to have some form of auditing that would be required. But notice I said auditing and not transparency. There are many different ways of cashing out the concept of transparency. One way of cashing out the concept of transparency is that everybody gets to see everything. That's not what we need here. What we need, however, is for some people to be able to see what these operations are like. Also, given the fact that much of what we're trying to look at is going to be protected by intellectual property or by trade secret law, we need to have a system by which we can respect that while still performing these public functions of auditing. This problem, by the way, of trade secrets and intellectual property is a problem not only in the context of the surveillance by social media. It's an incredibly difficult problem in the criminal justice system, in which states have turned to using algorithmic systems for doing all sorts of things, and these things are locked up because of intellectual property and trade secret law. And here, too, you need some system of audits or some set of ombudsman or somebody basically who can look behind the algorithm to see whether, in fact, it's doing what it's supposed to do.
Hello, my name is Joshua Maddox. My favorite piece of technology would have to be my Native Instruments machine. It's a little music production software thing.
It's very good.
Pretty fun. So my question has to do with the recent contract that Google was thinking about entering into with the United States government. I know that they were looking at providing some sort of technology for them to help them and I think aid them in their drone strikes, I believe.
Aid them in their what?
Drone strikes.
Oh, wow.
So my question really is if we were to move towards a system where we would have information fiduciaries, how do you believe the relationship between the government and private sector firms would, I guess, affect things such as counterterrorism or anything to that?
And this is a great question, because when we've been talking about the information fiduciary concept, we're mostly imagining a situation in which the companies protect end users, the interests of end users. But you're raising a really important point. There are lots of ways this technology can be used that will threaten not people who are the end users of the technology, but third parties. And third parties not in the United States, but overseas, for example. And here, I have to confess, I don't think the concept of information fiduciaries is really going to help you. Here, I think you have to call on a different set of moral norms and moral obligations, because here you're talking about restraining the kinds of things that governments armed with technology are willing to do when they project their power overseas and in all parts of the world. Here, I think that the proper set of norms to think about would be international human rights law.
Hi, I'm Anya Bernstein. I think actually the gadget that has improved my life, is this on?
Anya, you have to speak up a little bit more.
Yeah, it's technically on. I'm Anya Bernstein. I think the gadget that's improved my life the most has been the speakers with the microphone that allow me to have a phone conversation like I'm in the same room with someone.
Very nice.
And I guess I'm wondering about other analogies we might use for what you're doing. So you're using a kind of the fiduciary analogy. Seems like one of the things that happened to some of those products that were fueling the first Gilded Age was something like regulation as public utilities in the end. And I've just been trying to puzzle out what that might look like. You know, would we have kind of different sectors where maybe you could choose to participate in different areas of Facebook or Google or whatever, some of which were more surveillance heavy but allowed you to do more versus you know, surveillance light but product light area? How do you think that's an interesting analogy to work with?
Good. So this question is great because it raises two different problems. The first is, if you think the idea of a public utility is a good way forward, how would you put it into operation? It's the first question. I'll get back to it in a second. The second question, though, goes to the heart of the power of digital surveillance in our particular era. So one of the things that's so puzzling about surveillance, digital surveillance, is very difficult for people to get their arms around, is that when I surveil one end user, the information I get is useful not simply for targeting that end user, it's also useful for targeting a whole bunch of other people who I never collected the data on. That's because if I know certain things about you, I can connect that up with other digital profiles and make inferences about your likes and dislikes. So if we had a sort of surveillance heavy and surveillance light version of Facebook, I am concerned that Facebook would simply be able to leverage its data in the surveillance heavy part to make inferences about what happened in the surveillance light part. So that's a problem, and it's a problem that follows from lots of different forms of surveillance, right? But there's a second issue. So let's think about public utilities. Public utilities during the progressive era were largely about lowering the cost of particular important goods and also making sure that everyone had access to them. It doesn't seem that that's the central problem at this point. It's not the low cost plus access. If you wanted to use the idea of a public utility, the way you might do it is this, and here we get antitrust involved. You might say Facebook and Google and Twitter, just to take 3 examples, are actually hybrid enterprises. They have a social media curation of feed part, and then they have this larger infrastructure that on which that sits, that basically is a messaging delivery service, right? So an antitrust solution, which by the way I'm not necessarily recommending, I'm just saying how it would work, would be to separate out the curational part of Facebook, which is advertiser driven, from the message delivery service, and treating the message delivery infrastructure as the public utility. And that's possible. The question, of course, then is what you're going to get out of it. That is, it seems to me that what you would most likely to get out of it is not access, but rather breaking up the total economic power of the company and its ability to leverage its economic power in a bunch of different ways. But if we're thinking about the antitrust remedy, there are lots of different ways to do it. One is to separate functions. Another way is to break up into different communities. And that might be useful because, take the Russian hacking, for example. It might well be, although I'm not certain, but it might well be that it's much tougher to hack 12 social media sites than it is to hack 1. Because each social media site will evolve in a different way, and it will have different ways that you deal with it, and so it might be a good defense to basically multiply different forms of social media sites. Here antitrust is relevant too for the following reason. Facebook had the very clever idea, in order to avoid antitrust scrutiny for mergers, instead of waiting until a competitor got very large and then try to buy it, at which point there would be question of whether the merger is appropriate, it would scope out which different kinds of applications were likely to be successful. And then it would buy them really quickly early on. And so nobody ever thought that this was a problem of merger. And so one of the things that Facebook really did, and they were clever in doing, was really seeing, they were better than any venture capitalist, seeing who was likely to be a future competitor and basically buying them up. And either incorporating their ideas into Facebook or basically just throwing them away. If you had serious antitrust regulation here along the lines we're talking about, you might actually get more innovation, not less innovation, and that might in fact be a useful defense against, if I may quote Harry Potter, the dark arts.
Hello. My name is Ari Goldberg. I'm a former student of UB Law School. My question is about...
And what is your favorite gadget or technology?
I'm a new father, and I really like the baby monitor we have.
Good. So you're into the surveillance. You
yes.
love the surveillance.
It makes me feel like Big Brother. So.
Yeah, very good.
My question is about some of these free services like Twitter, Facebook, adding streams of revenue in the form of microtransactions. So if you're on Twitter and you want to make a tweet that has more than the character allotment, you pay 99 cents to have more access to the service. Or if Facebook dings you for violating terms of use, you pay 99 cents to get out of Facebook jail. And if you think those additional streams of revenue would make some of the data that they mine less valuable.
No, actually, I don't think so at all. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is the mere fact that they find a segment of the population that's willing to pay for a service, enhanced services, doesn't mean that they will trade off by engaging in less data collection and analysis. It'll just be extra goodness, right? It's just like if I let a third party make use of the data, I don't sell it to them, but I let them access the database, and then I take some percentage of the profits. That's just extra goodness, extra property goodness. So you'd have to give me an economic model in which it would lead to less surveillance, and I'm not sure that would happen. Similarly, to go back to what Anya and I were talking about, is that even if you relax surveillance in one area, you still have lots of inferences you can make based upon the other people you're actually surveilling.
Okay. I'm Errol Meidinger from the faculty here.
So your favorite gadget?
I'm in the dark ages. It's still my laptop, although I have other ones.
Your Mac. It's your favorite thing.
Yeah, it is. It is. Has been for a while.
Is anybody recording your keystrokes by any chance?
Well, quite possibly. I can't prove that they're not.
Right.
So
did you tape over the camera?
I have. Not right now, but we had that period when that was desirable.
Yeah.
Okay, but quickly, I think there's an analogy that I'd like to make. The description of the situation where the organization that has the capacity to do the regulation is the organization itself, is Facebook or whatever. Right. And there are analogies in regulation. I do mostly environmental regulation. There are analogies in human rights regulation, where then the challenge gets. We call it regulating at a distance, where there's some framework in which the organization has to operate that tries to use the organization to achieve these goals. In this case, non-destructive surveillance. And so I was just trying to, and I agree that the problem here of ensuring fidelity to purpose is enormous because of the trade secrets and the competitiveness around the technology. Now, and I think it's even greater. So in the environmental world, what you have is you have NGOs and people who can see things that are being done wrong who report, and then the environmental agency should adjust to take into account those reports, and then make sanctions available.
And who are the observers in these?
Well, the observers might be people who use a river, or or they might be NGOs who use technology, not satellite technology, to see that forests are being cut down when they shouldn't be. So the idea then in this field is to try to create institutional arrangements so that those enforcers, non-state enforcers, can get leverage. So my question to you is, well, what would be the analogy here? Are there analogies? I suppose one obvious possibility is whistleblowers. We've seen various whistleblowers show up late in the case of Facebook, but they're showing up. But then we have confidentiality agreements. So I guess what I'm trying to raise for discussion is what institutional mechanism, what legal arrangements would have to be tweaked if you actually want to get meaningful monitoring and accounting in such a technologically closed and competitive system.
Right. So if you wanted to do that, you might take a page from your suggestion about public utilities in another way and embed public regarding ombudsmen or directors or personnel within these large corporations after they got to be a certain size. The other way that it happens right now, I should just point out, is through compliance mechanisms with privacy regulation. So as you know, this coming month, the European Union's GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, is coming into effect. And although the GDPR has lots of problems with it, it really does strike a blow for privacy protection. One of the most interesting things to study over the next couple of years is the way in which it actually gets implemented, right? There's going to be an enormous amount of corporate money spent in implementation, in designing and redesigning systems to comply with the GDPR. And it seems to me the closest analogy to what you're talking about. That and very often the case, these government officials are working fairly closely with corporate officials in implementation. And you can have it close or far away as you like. There are a lot of ways of designing it. But I suspect that's probably the closest analogy other than a system of ombudsmen embedded within the organization.
Do you think it's a good idea?
It really depends. Actually, I think it really depends on the underlying regulation. If you have a ineffectual regulation, then in fact the embedding and the corporate compliance doesn't really do all that much good. And indeed, if anything, it tends to legitimate the existing business practices of the company. I assume that there are analogies like that within environmental law, right? Right. So in other words, everything you've seen before in environmental law, I suspect would probably be, there would probably be analogies in this space too.
So we have time for 2 or 3 more questions. So,
hi, Tico. Nice to see you. I feel like asking.
What is your favorite?
I feel like asking that is like asking an alcoholic what their favorite, bourbon is.
So everything, basically.
Well, I hate them all, especially my. It's a struggle.
It's a struggle.
One day at a time.
Every day is a struggle.
Yeah. So it would have to be my iPhone, and it's but it's problematic. So the question is a little. I feel like in our day and age, it's like I think our relationships are adverse, so they're not favorites often. Yeah. I was wondering about.
Could you tell me more about your personal life?
Yeah. What do you want to know? So I want to ask about the theme of value and distribution of value, which I take it as an underlying frame on pairing these two gilded ages, that there's a maldistribution through of an inequality of wealth and so forth. And the fiduciary idea, I like that. It seems I wanted to push you to the more ambitious, futuristic side of your multiple personalities, and ask about, there's something actually, we can see the dystopian in the current moment easily, and I think you sketched that out beautifully, but there's also something very utopian. Going back to like Lockean labor theories of values or Marxist ideas of like what the future state will look like, where people will just create value spontaneously, that there's something in human action and activity, and actually the source of value there is value in human being alive, in interacting, gossiping, and we've had this weird diversion where value was only going to be recognized in this thing called the market through the labor contract or what have you. But now, and this is the utopian conception of the current moment, we are in this moment where we've created a structure that actually sees the value in everyday human interaction.
Yes.
And that's like incredible.
Yes.
And now, of course, the downside is we've structured the distribution of who gets that value in a particular way. But so to tap into your other side, your sort of futuristic side, the fiduciary concept doesn't address that incredible potential that we're all now monetized and sources of value. And so do you think about ways of addressing and sort of harnessing this, in a way, a very positive side, that we are seen now as sites of value? And of course, then the problem is, as you said, you're working for the man. So I feel like we've got lots of other legal ways of conceptualizing these kinds of relationships, like maybe this is sort of like an employment relationship. You're working for Facebook. Maybe regulation through the Commerce Clause around these kinds of weird relationships where we're not paying. You called it the grand bargain, but maybe it's an unconscionable bargain to be working for free in this sense. So I was just wondering about how to not just do this rather conservative thing of trying to not have the value abused, but how to conceptualize its distribution now that we've really, it seems, created this amazing way of understanding this old insight of that there is value inherent in life and in interaction.
So I actually disagree a little bit with the premise of the question. You'll see maybe we don't disagree so much, but let me try to take you back to the early days of the internet. The promise of the early days of the internet was the possibility of the creation, of the unleashing of enormous amount of human creativity through giving people access to new tools and things they could build things, relationships, organizations, and mores, conventions with. In a sense, that's been realized, although there are many things to regret about what we've produced, the culture we've produced. In another sense, I would not want to go back to a world in which all of this creativity and all of this experimentation with value and all of this imagination was bottled up again and not made available to the general public. Even the silly parts of the internet, it strikes me, have enormous value to them if we're prepared to look at them in this particular way. The question for me is not whether or not we should try to find some way of giving people checks or money for their play, for their entertainment, for their communication with their friends and relatives. It's rather encouraging people to play and have fun and make use and communicate and throw off all of the things that they throw off when they do this, and prevent those who make it possible from abusing them. And so that's why it may sound to you like the fiduciary model is conservative, but there's a sense in which the fiduciary model is trying to preserve what I think is most exciting about the world that the digital age created. There's also a sense that if we start to treat play, the kind of activity, as work, then people will begin to regard it as work. And they will see it differently, and they'll behave differently. Let me just give you a very simple example. Imagine that you wanted to create the world's largest archive of every single piece of information and opinion, and you wanted it to be available to everyone for free, so that it was better than any library that had ever existed, better than any museum that had ever existed, better than any archive that had ever existed. How would you go about doing it? Well, one way is you could hire a bunch of people to just collect every possible thing they could imagine, and you could pay them, and you could put it in a site. There's another way you could do it. You could just lower the cost of communication, storage, writing, and broadcasting, and in a very short period of time, you would have the largest, most varied, most rich archive that has ever been known to man. And that's what we have. We created it. We created it not because somebody paid us to do it or because we expected to get something in return in terms of money. We paid it just because we're creative and we're manic and we're intense and we're neurotic and we really want completion and we really like collecting things and we really like showing off and we really like entertaining other people and we really like just doing stuff and showing other people that we did it. That's what I want to preserve, but I don't want the cost of that to be that other people manipulate us and take advantage of us. That's the bargain I'm trying to preserve. One more question? You want to stop with that? All right, excellent. Guys, it was wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much.